Gothic, what does the word make you think of? Most likely it conjures up imagery of alternative kids with jet black hair and a plethora of black clothing. Then again, it may make you think of grand medieval architecture and vast cathedrals with elaborate decoration rendered in stone and glass. Perhaps the last thing that Gothic would make you think of would be the late antique Germanic people, known for their infamous sack of Rome in 410 AD, the Goths. And yet, it was the Goths who lent their name to the Gothic subculture and the Gothic artistic and architectural movements. Before we continue, I want to be honest with you. This isn't a flashy, fast-paced documentary. If you're expecting new visuals on screen every 10 seconds, I would recommend you to literally turn off the video, because this is not for you. But for those who are here for actual detailed ancient history, let's continue. The name Gothic, never used by medieval artists and architects, was brought back into usage during the Renaissance as a pejorative. Giorgio Vasari, Italian architect and historian, used it in the 1540s in an attempt to denigrate the styles of the medieval period, which he considered to be barbaric. By the 18th and 19th centuries, renewed interest in medievalism led to a revival of Gothic architecture and a new Gothic movement in literature, with authors taking a notable interest in the macabre, such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. By the mid to late 20th century, Gothic had begun to influence music too, arguably giving rise to the Gothic subculture that we see today. Throughout all these incarnations, the original meaning of the word Goth has become obscured. This Germanic people are little known beyond their name, but they had an enormous impact on the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, and a major part to play in the post-Roman history of Western Europe. It is true that they sacked Rome and never truly lived it down. However, there is much more to these Goths than that. They were craftsmen and artists, producing some incredibly fine golden artifacts. They farmed and traded, often enjoying cordial relations with their neighbours. Their fierce warriors fought both against and alongside the armies of the Romans. Note that I will briefly discuss the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, but these two peoples are certainly worthy of their own in-depth explorations. Today, we will attempt to better understand this people and answer the question, who were the Goths? The earliest origins of the Goths, as with many peoples in ancient Europe beyond the borders of the Roman Empire, are shrouded in mystery and semi-legend. The earliest written sources we have which appear to discuss the Goths are Roman and date from the 1st century AD. However, these are somewhat unclear in their placement of the Goths, probably owing in large part to the fact that the regions these Roman authors were discussing lay far beyond the boundaries of the empire. For the earliest origins of the Goths, we must turn to a later text penned in the mid-6th century by none other than a Goth, a bureaucrat working in Constantinople by the name of Jordanes. In his stunning work known as the Zetike, Jordanes offers a glimpse into the earliest history of the Goths. Although his account was no doubt influenced by later texts and histories which discuss this Germanic people, Jordanes must have been in close touch with his Gothic culture and perhaps made use of oral traditions that were no doubt passed down through it. On the homeland of the Goths, Jordanes has this to say: "The mighty sea, which has in its Arctic region, that is in the north, a great island named Scanza, from which my tale, by God's grace, shall take its beginning. For the race whose origin you ask to know burst forth like a swarm of bees from the midst of this island and came into the land of Europe. Located across the Baltic Sea northwards from the mouth of the Vistula, Jordanes Scanza can be none other than Scandinavia. It is from here the Gothic author reports that his people issued forth, migrating southwards into the European mainland under their king Berig, settling in the region he names as Gothiscanza. It is natural to be critical of such a claim given that Jordanes was writing centuries after the events that he describes. The Getica was completed around 550 AD, meaning Jordanes was looking back some 6 or 7 centuries to describe events that occurred in the 1st century BC or 1st century AD. This temporal distance raises obvious questions about accuracy and the potential for legendary embellishment to creep into the historical record. Although subject to some debate, it is generally agreed that what scant sources we do have concerning the origins of the Goths do point to a Scandinavian origin. Linguistic evidence supports this conclusion. Gothic, as an East Germanic language, shares certain features with the Old Norse and other Scandinavian languages that suggest common ancestry. Archaeological patterns also lend credence to the migration story, though the details remain contested. While Jordanes' claim of a wholesale migration of the entire Gothic people is possible, it seems more likely such a migration would have been a slower process taking place over the course of many decades, perhaps even centuries. Population movements in antiquity rarely occurred as single dramatic events, but rather as gradual drift of families and clans seeking new opportunities or fleeing deteriorating conditions. Furthermore, it is thought that the Gothic settlement in Gothiscanza, described by Jordanes, may well relate to the Vielbach culture, a material culture which flourished around the lower Vistula in the 1st century AD. The Vielbach culture, closely associated with Germanic peoples, in particular the Goths, replaced the previously resident Oxiwi culture and is marked by the use of stone circles, inhumation rather than cremation, and notably the lack of weapons in warrior graves. This last feature, the absence of grave weapons, is particularly distinctive and would become a characteristic marker of Gothic burial practices for centuries. Why the Goths did not include weapons in graves while most other Germanic peoples did remains a matter of scholarly debate. Some suggest it reflects different religious beliefs about the afterlife. Others propose more practical explanations, such as the value of metal goods making their burial wasteful, or social structures that treated weapons as collective clan property rather than personal possessions. Let me show you some numbers that illustrate the scale of the Vielbach culture. Archaeological surveys have identified over 1,000 Vielbach culture sites scattered across modern Poland. These sites typically consist of cemeteries with between 50 and 200 burials, suggesting communities of perhaps 200 to 800 people per settlement. The total population represented by the Vielbach culture may have numbered between 50,000 and 100,000 people at its height in the 2nd century AD. There are literary attestations concerning the Goths' time on the shores of the Baltic too. Writing in the late 1st century AD, Pliny the Elder described a group called the Gutones as belonging to the Vandalic peoples, whereas Tacitus, writing in around 98 AD, explained that a group of Germani known as Gothones dwelt beyond the Vandals near the ocean. The location of the Przeworsk culture associated with the Vandals to the south of the Vielbach culture certainly appears to support this assertion. Intriguingly, Tacitus also details in his annals how the Gothones assisted a certain noble, named Catualda, in overthrowing the hegemony of the Marcomanni. This reference, dating to the early 1st century AD, provides one of our earliest definite mentions of the Goths and demonstrates that they were already significant enough players in Germanic politics to influence the power dynamics of more southerly tribes. The 2nd century brought with it enormous upheaval for the Goths, as the Veilbark culture appears to have begun a wholesale geographical shift southeastward towards the shores of the Black Sea. This migration did not happen in isolation either, but was rather part of the wider southern movement of Germanic tribes in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. The reasons for these migrations are heavily debated and include the desire for more fertile lands, massive population growth, and military and social pressure from other migrating tribes, which caused a domino effect. Climate change may have also played a role. The 2nd century AD saw the end of the Roman warm period and the beginning of cooler, wetter conditions in northern Europe that may have reduced agricultural productivity and prompted southward movement. It was likely the migrations of groups such as the Vandals and the Goths which precipitated the beginning of the Marcomannic Wars, lasting from 166 to 180 AD. These conflicts saw Germanic Quedi and Marcomannic tribes crossing the Danube frontier into the Roman Empire in search of new lands in which to settle themselves, having been ejected from their homelands by the Vandals and Goths pushing southward. The Marcomannic Wars represented one of the greatest crises faced by the Roman Empire in the 2nd century. Emperor Marcus Aurelius spent the last years of his life campaigning on the Danube frontier, dying at Vindobona, modern Vienna, in 180 AD. The wars demonstrated the vulnerability of Rome's northern frontiers to pressure from migrating Germanic peoples, and foreshadowed the far more serious crises that would erupt in subsequent centuries. According to Jordanes, the Goths, led by a king named Philomer, eventually reached the land north of the Black Sea, named in antiquity as Scythia. This part of the Goths, which is said to have crossed the river and entered with Philomer into the country of Oyum, came into possession of the desired land, and there they soon came upon the race of the Spali, joined battle with them, and won the victory. Hence the victors hastened to the farthest part of Scythia, which is near the Sea of Pontus. For so the story is generally told in their early songs in almost historic fashion. Defeating the resident Spali, who are perhaps Sarmatians, the Goths settled in the fertile regions north of the Black Sea, largely within the modern borders of Ukraine. This was prime territory, the steppelands that had supported numerous nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples over the centuries. The rich black earth, called Chernozem, was among the most fertile soil in Europe, capable of supporting dense agricultural populations. Although the history of Philomer is debated, with some scholars questioning whether he was a historical figure or a legendary ancestor, Jordanes' account appears to be largely borne out by the archaeological record. For by the mid-3rd century AD, the southern movement of the Veilbark culture seems to have led to the formation of the Chernyakov culture, and although not exclusively comprised of Goths, the Chernyakov culture, attested from evidence discovered at some 3,000 sites, is certainly believed to have been dominated by them. The sheer scale of the Chernyakov culture is remarkable. Sites are found across an enormous geographical area from the Danube to the Don River, encompassing modern Ukraine, Moldova, and parts of Romania and southern Russia. This represents a territory of approximately 500,000 square kilometres. So began a period of sedentary settlement by the Goths, during which their society developed an agricultural focus. So too began the Goths' relationship with the Roman Empire, a sometimes collaborative, often antagonistic relationship, which saw regular Gothic raids into Roman territory. This is also the period in which Roman sources began to write in earnest on the subject of the Goths. Beginning with a sack of Histria on the mouth of the Danube in 238 AD, the Goths embarked upon decades of raiding into Roman lands, even defeating and killing the Emperor Decius at the Battle of Abritus in 251 AD, led by a chieftain named Neva. The Battle of Abritus was a catastrophe for Rome. Not only did the emperor die, but his son Herennius Etruscus was also killed, and Roman losses may have exceeded 20,000 men. This marked the first time a Roman emperor had died in battle against barbarians since the defeat of Valerian by the Persians. Let me show you numbers that reveal the scale of Gothic raiding in this period. Between 250 and 270 AD, Gothic forces conducted at least 15 major raids into Roman territory. These raids struck provinces including Moesia, Thrace, Macedonia, Achaea, and even reached as far south as Athens. A single raid in 267 AD reportedly involved a fleet of 500 ships, suggesting a Gothic force of perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 warriors. These Germanic incursions were not limited to land either. Gothic ships ravaged the Roman coastal settlements along the shores of the Black Sea, referred to by the Romans as the Sea of Pontus. The Goths, who had originated from the Baltic shores and must have possessed considerable maritime expertise, adapted quickly to conditions on the Black Sea. They built or captured ships, learned navigation routes, and conducted amphibious operations that struck terror into Roman coastal communities. It is likely in such a raid that the progenitors of Ulfilas, the Gothic Christian responsible for proselytizing his people, were carried off from Anatolia, taken as slaves to live in Gothic lands. The practice of taking captives in raids served multiple purposes for the Goths. Slaves provided labour for agriculture and craft production. Skilled captives brought valuable knowledge and techniques, and the ransoming of important prisoners could yield significant wealth. Gothic raids became such an issue that successive emperors conducted campaigns in order to secure the Danube frontier. Gallienus, Claudius II, and Aurelian all fought extensively in the northern Balkans and largely succeeded in checking Gothic movements in the region by the close of the 3rd century. Claudius II earned the honorific Gothicus for his victory over the Goths at the Battle of Naissus in 269 AD, reportedly killing 50,000 Gothic warriors. The frontier thus secure, the Goths and Romans enjoyed largely peaceful relations for some decades, interspersed with the odd outbreak of warfare. Now well within the Roman sphere of political influence, the Goths found themselves involved in internal imperial politics at times. The outbreak of civil war at the beginning of the reign of Constantine the Great saw the Goth side with the losing Licinius, and suffered defeat at the hands of the victorious Constantine as a result. And in the 360 S, the Goths once again intervened in Roman civil conflict, continuing their track record of backing losers when they fought on the side of the usurper Procopius against the rule of Eastern Emperor Valens. Valens' subsequent campaigns against the Goths concluded with a peace treaty in 369 between the Roman Emperor and the Gothic chief Athanaric, known to have been from the Thervingi tribe. This treaty of 369 AD was significant for establishing formal diplomatic relations between Rome and the Goths. The treaty apparently stipulated that trade would be conducted at designated points along the frontier, rather than allowing free movement across the border. This arrangement benefited both parties, allowing Rome to monitor and tax Gothic trade while providing the Goths with access to Roman goods and markets. This treaty certainly appears to have only deepened Roman Gothic links, as a great deal of Roman goods and coinage have been found in Gothic lands beyond the Danube. Archaeological excavations at Chernyakov culture sites have uncovered thousands of Roman coins, particularly from the 4th century. Fine Roman glassware, amphorae that once contained wine or oil, bronze vessels and luxury goods all attest to extensive trade relationships. It would appear that by the late 4th century AD, the Goths and Romans lived in relative peace. Trading benefited both peoples. Gothic troops regularly served under Roman banners, and Gothic chieftains enjoyed ever closer political relations with Roman imperial power. Some Gothic nobles received Roman education, learned Latin, and adopted Roman customs. The cultural boundary between Roman and Goth was becoming increasingly blurred. The westward movement of the Huns, whose progress across the Eurasian steppe brought with it enormous upheaval, had a dire impact upon the Goths. The nomadic Huns were fiercely warlike, fighting on horseback and armed with highly effective composite bows. Although they had encountered steppe peoples before, Roman authors recognized the Huns as a uniquely dangerous threat. Roman attitudes towards them are nicely reflected in a passage from the Res Gestae of the 4th century Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus. He described the Huns as having squat bodies, strong limbs and thick necks, and are so prodigiously ugly and bent that they might be two-legged animals, or the figures crudely carved from stumps which are seen on the parapets of bridges. This description, while obviously biased and xenophobic, reflects the genuine shock and fear that the Huns inspired in Roman observers. Their appearance, customs, and fighting methods were all alien to Roman experience. The Huns represented something genuinely new and terrifying to the peoples of the late Roman world. The arrival of the Huns was an unmitigated disaster for the Goths. Hunnic attacks on the Alans put them to flight, and a combination of Hunnic and Alan pressure forced the easternmost Goths, known as the Greuthungi, to abandon their lands north of the Black Sea following a period of resistance, joining the Thervingi Goths further west, who at this time were still led by the chieftain Athanaric. The collapse of Gothic resistance to the Huns happened with shocking speed. The Greuthungi king Ermanaric, who according to Jordanes had ruled over a vast empire stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, either died in battle against the Huns or committed suicide in despair at his people's defeat. His successor Vithimiris also died fighting the Huns. Within a few years, the entire Gothic position north of the Black Sea had crumbled. Despite Athanaric's desire to resist the Huns, near-constant attacks proved to be overwhelming, and the Goths were sent into a headlong westward flight. Petitioning the Emperor Valens, the Goths requested permission to settle in the Roman-controlled Balkans. The Eastern Roman Emperor, realizing the threat that such large numbers of Goths could pose, attempted to divide them, granting only the Thervingi the right to cross the frontier in 376 AD. The numbers involved in this migration were enormous. Ancient sources claim that 200,000 Goths crossed the Danube, though this figure may be exaggerated. Even if we reduce it by half, we're still talking about 100,000 people, including men, women, children, and elderly. This was not a war band, but an entire people in motion, carrying their possessions, driving their livestock, fleeing a terror they could not resist. However, this policy was to prove disastrous when the Thervingi, apparently agitated by a lack of food supplies and perhaps also by corrupt Roman officials attempting to exploit their weakness, rose in open revolt against imperial authorities in early 377 AD. The Greutungi took their chance and crossed the frontier, joining their compatriots in the Balkans. Roman mismanagement of the Gothic refugees was catastrophic. The sources report that corrupt officials forced the Goths to sell their children into slavery in exchange for dog meat. Whether literally true or not, this detail captures the desperation of the Gothic situation and the exploitation they suffered. Treated as invaders rather than refugees, denied adequate supplies, and abused by officials, the Goths had little choice but to rebel. For over a year, the region remained in a state of ferment until in the summer of 378, the Eastern Emperor Valens, finally able to marshal his forces, marched upon the Goths with his nephew, the Western Roman Emperor Gratian, approaching from the west. On the 9th of August 378 AD, the Emperor Valens, eager to secure the victory and therefore the plaudits, engaged the Gothic forces at Adrianople in the Balkans, possibly acting on false intelligence that the Goths only numbered some 10,000 men. The battle was an utter defeat for the Romans, perhaps on par with the massacre at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Led by the Thervingi king Fritigern, the Goths completely routed an impetuous and unprepared imperial field army, largely aided by their heavy cavalrymen. Roman casualties are estimated to have been as high as 10,000 to 15,000 men. Perhaps even more embarrassing was the death of Valens himself on the battlefield. It is unknown exactly how the emperor perished, but it seems likely that he would have been separated from his bodyguard and slain in the rout. The Battle of Adrianople represents one of the most decisive engagements in ancient military history. The Roman army that took the field that day was not a frontier garrison or a hastily assembled levy, but the mobile field army of the Eastern Empire, Rome's best troops equipped with the finest weapons and armour. The destruction of this force left the Eastern Empire virtually defenceless. Adrianople was a turning point, not just for the Goths, but for the entire Roman Empire. Arguably, it was this defeat which set in motion a chain of events which eventually led to the downfall of the Roman Empire in the West. Following the battle, the Goths found themselves as masters of the Balkans. In 382 AD, the new Eastern Emperor Theodosius I, realizing that defeating the Goths by military means would be incredibly difficult, made peace. The treaty allowed the Goths to freely settle in the Balkans under their own leaders in return for pledges of military support to the Eastern Emperor. This treaty of 382 AD established a new model for barbarian Roman relations. Rather than attempting to expel or exterminate the Goths, Rome accepted their permanent settlement within imperial borders as federate allies. They would live under their own laws, led by their own chieftains, but would provide military service when required. This arrangement would be replicated with other barbarian groups throughout the 5th century. The peace brought with it some semblance of the stability that the Goths had been seeking for decades. Ensconced in their new lands, these Germanic people were once again able to resume their agricultural society. It was in this violent aftermath of the Hunnic invasions that a split emerged in the Goths. The majority of those who had crossed the frontier into the empire came to be known as Visigoths, literally Western Goths, whilst the bulk of those that remained subject to the Huns were known as Ostrogoths, or Eastern Goths. The etymology of these names is somewhat complex. Visigoth may derive from the Gothic term for the good or the noble, rather than simply meaning Western, while Ostrogoth similarly may mean the brilliant rather than simply Eastern. However, the geographical interpretation became dominant in later usage and accurately reflects the division that had occurred. This uneasy peace was not to last, however. The actions of two Gothic chieftains by the names of Radagaisus and Alaric once again threw the Roman Empire into chaos and culminated in an event which gave the Goths their reputation as despoilers, the 410 AD sack of Rome. We shall return to the historical narrative later. For now, we shall take a look at the society and culture of the Goths. Gothic society, like the vast majority of contemporary societies, was highly stratified and appears by the 3rd and 4th centuries AD to have been divided into clans or kindreds, usually based around the rule of associated great families who inhabited roughly delineated geographical areas forming single economic, social and political units. Generally, each village was dominated by one such great family. Wealthy Gothic nobles often owned considerable portions of land, whilst the majority of the population were common peasants surviving through subsistence farming. Slaves of various kinds, either indentured servants or prisoners of war, performed many of society's menial tasks. The proportion of the population that was enslaved is difficult to determine, but may have ranged from 10 to 20%, based on comparisons with other ancient societies. Councils did exist, often led by elders, and would convene in villages under special circumstances. True political power appears to have been primarily concentrated in the hands of warlords known as rakes, who were often the heads of clans or great families. The kings or rakes drew their power from the great land-owning families and ruled in a somewhat centralized fashion. Certainly, there seem to have been disagreements between rakes and local clan nobles which portray this. The title rakes itself is linguistically related to the Latin rex and the Celtic rix, all deriving from a Proto-Indo-European root meaning ruler or king. This linguistic connection demonstrates the common cultural heritage of the Indo-European peoples, despite their geographical separation and divergent development. Excavations of Gothic sites on the Pontic steppe appear to show small settlements in which the vast majority of the population lived in houses or huts constructed of wood and earth, with the ground floor partially sunken into the ground to aid in protection against the elements. These sunken floored buildings, called Grubenhäuser in German or pit houses in English, were common throughout Germanic Europe. The typical Gothic house measured between 4 and 6 metres square and was sunk approximately 1 metre into the ground. The sunken floor provided insulation against both summer heat and winter cold. Walls were constructed of vertical wooden posts with wattle and daub filling the spaces between. Roofs were likely thatched with straw or reeds. A central hearth provided heating and cooking facilities, with smoke escaping through a hole in the roof or through the doorway. Many Gothic sites appear to have been located in close proximity to rivers and Roman trading outposts. The significance of animal raising is clear to see in the fact that houses often contain spaces for both humans and animals, so-called byre houses, which allowed Gothic farmers to shelter both themselves and their livestock from the harsh winters of the Black Sea steppe. Let me show you numbers that illustrate the scale of Gothic settlements. Archaeological surveys of Chernyakov culture sites reveal that typical villages contained between 10 and 30 houses, suggesting populations of 50 to 200 people per settlement. Larger sites, possibly serving as regional centres, might contain up to 100 houses and populations approaching 500 people. The total number of Chernyakov culture sites identified exceeds 3,000, implying a regional population that may have reached 1 million people or more. I will not venture into too much detail on the society of Ostrogothic Italy or Visigothic Spain, but it is important to note that the Gothic inhabitants of these realms became increasingly Romanized as the decades and centuries wore on. The divide between the Gothic ruling class and Roman subject peoples became increasingly faint as the Germanic invaders adopted localized customs. These are perhaps most visible in the art and architecture of these kingdoms. Many elements of Gothic society were changed a great deal through increasing contact with the Roman Empire. Gothic warfare was no exception. Armies comprised mostly of heavily armed infantry soldiers were the order of the day amongst the Goths. Warriors were customarily equipped with a wooden shield and a straight longsword or a scramasax, a kind of small sword or fighting knife often used by Germanic warriors. The scramasax deserves particular attention, as it was the characteristic weapon of Germanic peoples for centuries, typically measuring between 30 and 60 centimeters in length. The scramasax was a single-edged blade that could be used both as a weapon and as a tool. Every free man would have owned one, and they were sufficiently valued to often be included as grave goods, even in otherwise poorly furnished burials. Throwing weapons such as axes and pole arms such as spears were often used. The Francisca, a throwing axe associated particularly with the Franks, may have also been used by the Goths. Spears were probably the most common weapon, as they were relatively inexpensive to produce and effective in formation fighting. The Goths did not have standing armies in the Roman style. Instead, the vast majority of Gothic warriors would have been farmers raised as levies on a short-term basis and sent home to their farms upon the conclusion of a campaign. This system was relatively cheap and easy to operate, but did mean that Gothic armies could usually not rove abroad for long periods of time, at least not during the periods in which the Goths were a sedentary agricultural people. The maximum duration of a Gothic campaign was probably limited to 2 or 3 months, the period when agricultural demands were lowest. Campaigning typically occurred in late summer and early autumn, after the harvest was gathered but before winter weather made movement difficult. This seasonality of warfare imposed significant constraints on Gothic military operations. The majority of Gothic troops would have been lightly armoured, relying primarily on their shields for defence. Richer warriors such as noblemen made use of metal armour, particularly as the Goths became settled in the land north of the Black Sea, and links with Romans became ever closer. Indeed, as the centuries progressed, well-armed Gothic troops became near indistinguishable from their Roman counterparts, making use of chainmail or lamella shirts, greaves, vambraces, and helmets constructed of either iron or steel, often in the Roman ridge helm style. The cost of armour was prohibitive for common soldiers. A full suit of chainmail might cost the equivalent of several years' income for a peasant farmer. Only wealthy nobles or professional warriors in the service of great lords could afford such equipment. This economic reality meant that the core of any Gothic army, the heavily armoured warriors who could stand in the front ranks and bear the brunt of combat, numbered only in the hundreds even in armies of several thousand men. Despite inhabiting Scythia, a land long ruled by peoples known for their horsemanship such as the Sarmatians, Roxolani and Alans, the Goths did not make extensive use of cavalry. This may perhaps be largely down to the expense involved in outfitting cavalry warriors for combat compared to infantry soldiers. A warhorse represented an enormous investment. The horse itself was expensive to acquire and required constant maintenance, needing far more fodder than could be obtained through grazing alone. The rider required specialized equipment including saddle, bridle, and weapons adapted for mounted combat. Training both horse and rider to fight effectively from horseback required years. All of this meant that cavalry could only be maintained by the wealthiest members of Gothic society. Gothic cavalry appear to have favoured the heavy lance, although no doubt would have been armed with swords as an additional weapon. The effectiveness of Gothic horsemen was certainly a proven fact, as at the Battle of Adrianople it was the late arrival of the cavalry which helped to carry the day for the Goths. It may well be the case that Gothic horsemen were responsible for the ignominious death of Emperor Valens. It is important to note that the Goths' ever-deepening relationship with the Romans during the 3rd and 4th centuries saw large numbers of Gothic troops serving in Roman armies. These postings doubtless not only increased Gothic martial prowess, but gifted the Goths with an intense familiarity with Roman weaponry and warfare techniques, knowledge that the Goths were certainly able to make use of during their many periods of warfare with the Empire. Gothic troops served both in Roman units as individuals and in separate Gothic units or foederati. Large numbers of Gothic troops were known to have participated in the Battle of the Frigidus on the side of the Roman Emperor Theodosius III as he quashed the rebellion of the usurper Eugenius. At the Frigidus, fought in 394 AD, approximately 10,000 Gothic warriors fought in Theodosius's army. They were placed in the front ranks and bore the brunt of the initial fighting, suffering enormous casualties. Some ancient sources claim that Theodosius deliberately sacrificed his Gothic troops to weaken them, though this may be hostile propaganda. Discoveries made at sites associated with the Chernyakov culture paint a picture of a society which primarily revolved around subsistence farming. Settlements were usually located in fertile river valleys so as to increase crop yields, and cereals such as wheat, barley, and millet were most commonly grown. Agricultural techniques employed by the Goths were relatively sophisticated. They used iron-tipped ploughs, an advancement over the simple wooden adze used in earlier periods. Crop rotation was practiced to maintain soil fertility. Fields were fertilized with animal manure. Grain was stored in pits lined with clay or in ceramic vessels, allowing surpluses to be maintained against harvest failures. As with most contemporary cultures, animal husbandry was crucial to the lives of many Goths. The discovery of large numbers of cattle bones would suggest that these animals were most often raised, but sheep, goats, and pigs were also kept, providing not only food but hides and wool for clothing. Let me show you the numbers from zooarchaeological analysis of Chernyakov culture sites. Cattle bones typically comprise 40 to 50% of animal remains found, suggesting these were the most important livestock. Sheep and goats account for another 30 to 40%. Pigs make up 10 to 20%. Horses, used for transport and warfare rather than food, represent only 5 to 10% of animal bones. The dominance of cattle reflects their multiple uses. They provided meat, milk, leather, and draft power for ploughing. Craft production was certainly carried out by the Goths, but likely on a very local scale. Evidently metalworking was practiced by the Goths, as implements used for agriculture have been found, including ploughshares, sickles, and scythes, as well as other items such as brooches and belt buckles. The production of iron tools required specialized knowledge and facilities. Iron ore had to be smelted in furnaces, then forged and shaped while hot. This required a blacksmith with years of training and access to substantial quantities of fuel, typically charcoal. Each village or group of villages probably had its own smith who produced tools and weapons for the local community. Fibulae, metal brooches for the fixing of clothing, and combs made of bone are commonly found at Gothic settlements. Fibulae serve both practical and decorative purposes. They fastened cloaks and other garments that lacked buttons or other closures. Their design and decoration could indicate the wearer's wealth and status. Bone combs were personal grooming items that were sufficiently valued to often be included in graves. Pottery was also produced. Relatively simple storage jars and cooking pots, as well as wide, shallow bowls, possibly used for drinking, have been found throughout Chernyakov cultural sites. Craft items appear to have been somewhat basic and were likely not traded abroad. Gothic pottery falls into two main categories: handmade and wheel-made. Handmade pottery shows considerable variation in form and decoration, suggesting production by individual craftspeople in their homes. Wheel-made pottery is more standardized, indicating specialized potters who produced vessels for wider distribution within Gothic territories. Trade did form a part of the Gothic economy during their period of settlement north of the Black Sea. Exports were primarily in the form of slaves sent to the slave markets of the Roman Empire. In return, the Goths purchased a variety of Roman goods. Glassware and amphorae have been found, along with large numbers of Roman coins, which only increase in number as the 4th century progressed. Wine and oil would have been common imports. The slave trade deserves particular attention, as it was probably the most valuable export from Gothic territories. Slaves were obtained through warfare, raids, and probably through internal social processes such as debt slavery. They are marched to frontier markets where Roman merchants purchased them for transport deeper into the empire. The scale of this trade was substantial. Thousands of slaves probably changed hands annually at peak periods. So important was trade that Ammianus Marcellinus noted how in times of war the interruption of trade caused severe shortages of goods amongst the Goths. The savages, since commerce was cut off, were so distressed by extreme scarcity of the necessities of life that they often sent suppliant deputations to beg for pardon and peace. This dependence on Roman trade goods created vulnerability for the Goths. When relations soured and trade was interrupted, the Goths lost access not just to luxuries like wine, but also to essential goods including salt, which was used for food preservation, and metal goods that could not be produced locally in sufficient quantities. The Gothic language is fascinating. It is primarily known to us from a small number of Gothic documents. The majority of these are translations of other languages, and it is therefore important to note that the Gothic in these texts is highly likely to have been influenced by these foreign languages. Most of these surviving codices are biblical texts deriving from the translation of the Bible, overseen by the Arian missionary and bishop of the Goths, Ulfilas. Many of the surviving fragments we do have are pages of parchment, where the Gothic script has been erased and overwritten, but where the original lettering can still be faintly discerned. These are known as palimpsests. The practice of erasing and reusing parchment was common throughout the medieval period due to the expense of producing new writing materials. Fortunately, the original text is often still partially legible through various imaging techniques. Part of the Indo-European language family, Gothic is an Eastern Germanic language. It has the distinguishing feature of being the oldest Germanic language, with a decent number of extant texts. However, Gothic does not appear to have any modern descendants, having apparently begun to decline in usage in the mid-6th century AD through a waning of Gothic political power and the victory of Nicene Christianity over Arianism, which saw the Visigothic Goths convert from the latter to the former. This conversion saw Gothic lose what was perhaps its only major function as a church language. The decline of Gothic as a living language probably occurred over several generations. As Visigothic and Ostrogothic kingdoms became more Romanized, Latin increasingly displaced Gothic in official and religious contexts. By the 7th century, Gothic may have survived only as a spoken language in isolated rural communities. By the 8th century, it was probably extinct in Western Europe, though it may have survived somewhat longer in Crimea. It is worth noting that a very small number of Gothic runic inscriptions do survive which predate the Gothic alphabet. However, the identification of these is subject to some debate. The most famous example is the Pietrasa ring, found in the Pietrasa treasure in Romania, which bears what appears to be a runic inscription in Gothic. However, interpreting these early inscriptions is difficult, and scholars disagree about whether they are genuinely Gothic or represent related Germanic languages. It was Ulfilas, adept in Greek, Latin and Gothic, who devised the Gothic script, apparently basing it off the Greek script with Latin and runic elements thrown in. It was this new script into which Ulfilas's Bible was translated. The creation of a new script, rather than simply using Latin or Greek letters, reflects Ulfilas's desire to establish Gothic as a legitimate liturgical language on par with Greek and Latin. Of the Gothic texts that do survive, the Codex Argentius is surely the finest and best known, a 6th century illuminated manuscript containing parts of Ulfilas's 4th century translation of the Greek Bible into Gothic. The Codex Argentius is an extraordinary artifact. Its pages are made of purple-dyed vellum, and the text is written in gold and silver ink. Only 188 pages survive of an original that probably contained over 300 pages. It was through Ulfilas and his Bible that the Goths became the first Germanic people to develop a literate culture. That said, Gothic does not ever appear to have become much of a literary language, and beyond biblical translations was not generally used by authors. The leading writers in the Gothic kingdoms in Spain and Italy, such as Sidonius Apollinaris and Isidore of Seville, wrote in Latin. Even ethnic Goth Jordanus penned his text on the history of the Goths in Latin. This preference for Latin reflects both the prestige of Roman culture and the practical reality that Latin was understood across a much wider geographical area than Gothic. An author who wrote in Latin could potentially reach readers throughout the former Roman world. An author who wrote in Gothic limited himself to a much smaller, exclusively Gothic audience. We know relatively little of early Gothic artistic work. Much of what we do know concerns items found at sites associated with the Chernyakov culture. Although this archaeological culture is strongly associated with the Goths, it is also important to remind ourselves that it appears to have included a number of other groups as well, such as the Germanic Gepids and Heruli, and the Iranian nomadic peoples who previously inhabited the region, the Scythians and Sarmatians. These diverse origins do appear to be reflected in elements of Gothic art. Pottery was certainly produced, although the primary reason for the vast majority of these pieces would have been practical, such as cooking or storage. Pottery was created both by hand and by wheel, and is similar in style to equivalent Sarmatian pieces, whilst also displaying some Roman influences. Handmade pieces have a greater variety of form and were sometimes decorated with linear designs cut into the surface of the clay. Metalwork is the artistic field in which the early Goths appear to have excelled. A variety of pieces have been found, mostly rendered in gold, including figures both of animals and of humans, and objects such as bowls, vases and cups. The Pietroassa treasure, a late 4th century Gothic hoard of some 22 objects discovered in Romania in 1837, provides us with the most famous and perhaps the finest of all examples of early Gothic art. An intricate bowl depicting figures in relief displays Hellenic influences. The bowl, known as the patera, shows a seated female figure, possibly a goddess, surrounded by other figures in classical poses. The quality of the workmanship and the iconographic program suggest that the piece was made by a craftsman trained in Roman or Greek artistic traditions. Winding gold-wrought baskets feature designs very similar to comparable Scythian works, and it has been suggested that the elaborate eagle brooch or fibula found in the hoard could be the result of Han Chinese artistic styles potentially transmitted by the Huns. Eagle motifs in this period are often associated with Eastern Asia, and the piece's stylistic elements do show some similarities to Eurasian steppe art. A ring from the hoard, known as the Ring of Pietroassa, even features an example of very rare Gothic runes. The inscription reads, Guteni Owi Heilag, generally interpreted as meaning sacred property of the Goths, or heritage of the Gothic people. This suggests the treasure may have been a sacred hoard belonging to a Gothic tribe or clan, rather than the personal property of an individual. Let me show you numbers that illustrate the value of the Pietroassa treasure. The hoard weighs approximately 19 kilograms of gold. At modern gold prices, this represents metal value alone of over $1 million. In 4th century terms, this quantity of gold represented enormous wealth, perhaps equivalent to the annual tax revenue from a small province. The treasure demonstrates the wealth that successful Gothic chieftains could accumulate through raiding, tribute, and trade. Later Gothic art, such as the works created by the craftsmen of the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, followed a similar vein. Heavily influenced by their neighbours and subject peoples, the Goths continued to produce various kinds of metalwork, including many incredible pieces inlaid with precious gems. The Germanic artistic traditions of the Visigoths and Ostrogoths appear to fade by the mid-6th century and beyond, with local Roman styles combined with Byzantine influences becoming the norm. Germanic motifs were replaced by plant and animal motifs originating from the Mediterranean and Near East. The crosses found at the so-called Treasure of Guarazar, the work of 7th century Visigoths, is an excellent example of this. There is evidence of Germanic metalworking here, but the ornamentation of these crosses is a total departure from early Gothic art, encrusted with sapphires, pearls, and other precious stones in a fashion very reminiscent of Byzantine style. The Guarazar treasure, discovered in 1858 near Toledo, Spain, consists of votive crowns and crosses donated by Visigothic kings to churches. These objects were never meant to be worn, but rather to be suspended above altars as offerings to God. The largest crown, donated by King Rekis Winth, weighs over 900 grams of gold and is decorated with pearls, sapphires, and hanging letters spelling out the king's name. Prior to the missions of Ulfilas in the 4th century AD and the subsequent conversion to Arian Christianity, the Goths practiced a form of Germanic paganism. We know precious little about Gothic paganism, not least because of the short time frame between their appearance in the historical sources in the 3rd century and their abandonment of Gothic paganism in the 4th century. Pre-Christian Gothic religion, like other forms of Germanic paganism, was polytheistic and appears to have involved the worship of not only gods, but of nature and ancestors. The Amali, a leading Gothic ruling clan or dynasty, certainly claim descent from the divine as mentioned by Jordanes, who explains that the Amali believed the father of the gods, Gaut or Goth, to be their progenitor. Their genealogy I shall run through briefly, telling the lineage of each and the beginning and end of his line. And do thou, O reader, hear me without repining, for I speak truly. Now the first of these heroes, as they themselves relate in their legends, was Gaut, who begat Hulmul. It may well be that the Goths themselves considered Gaut to be their common ancestor. In any case, Gaut was a mythical ancestor deity and creator god, and apparently father of the pantheon, drawing parallels to the later Norse god Odin. Modern scholars certainly believe this to be the case, asserting that Gaut was an earlier Indo-European Odinic god from whom Odin may well have developed. Scholars note that Gaut appears to at times have had a female aspect, suggesting a pairing of male and female divinities from whom the universe issued forth, naming this female goddess as Gothen. This pairing of male and female creative principles is common in Indo-European mythologies and may reflect Proto-Indo-European religious concepts dating back thousands of years. Aside from these scant facts, we know almost nothing of further divinities of Gothic paganism, save for the god Tyr, associated with the Germanic god Tiwaz and the Norse god Tyr, a war god identified as Mars by the Romans. Finally, the Gothic name Fergunes also survives, a weather god believed by scholars to refer to an early iteration of Thor. The Romans identified Fergunes as Jupiter. These identifications by Romans of Germanic gods with Roman deities reflect the Roman interpretatio Romana, the practice of understanding foreign gods through the lens of their own pantheon. While this provides some clues about the functions and characteristics of Gothic gods, it also obscures genuine differences between Germanic and Roman conceptions of divinity. Pre-Christian Gothic religious practices are rather hard to discern too, although it seems highly likely that they would have worshipped in a similar fashion to other Germanic pagans, venerating idols, ancestors, and nature itself through the performance of ritual sacrifice. Sacrifices probably included animals, with cattle, sheep, and horses being offered to the gods on important occasions. Human sacrifice may have been practiced, as it was among some other Germanic peoples, though evidence for this among the Goths specifically is lacking. Burial practices varied, although cremation slowly gave way to inhumation. However, in one particular behaviour, Gothic paganism does differ markedly from other forms of Germanic paganism: grave weapons. Whilst grave goods are a feature of Gothic paganism, the Goths do not appear to have buried warriors with their weapons in the fashion of almost all other Germanic pagans. However, this may have more to do with the early Christianization of the Goths. Grave weapons become most prominent in the 5th and 6th centuries AD, long after the Goths abandoned the old gods. The timing suggests that the absence of grave weapons in Gothic burials may reflect Christian influence, as Christianity generally discouraged such practices, viewing them as pagan customs that implied belief in a material afterlife requiring physical objects. It was Gothic raiding in the Black Sea region in the mid-3rd century AD, embarked upon with the intention of carrying off precious goods and treasures, which ultimately brought an unexpected element back to these Germanic tribesmen: Christianity. Slaves carried off northwards in such Gothic raids as these included many Christians from the coastal regions of Anatolia, such as Cappadocia and Bithynia. Once taken off to Gothic lands, many of these Christians refused to give up their faith, and were apparently permitted to continue to practice their religion amongst the pagan Goths. This tolerance of Christian practice among captives is somewhat surprising, but may reflect Gothic indifference to the religious practices of slaves, or a pragmatic recognition that attempting to force conversion would be counterproductive. It was into a family of such Christian Roman prisoners that the man who was to become the apostle of the Gothic people was born, Ulfilas, likely born in around the year 311 AD. Ulfilas was raised in a community of Cappadocian Christians living within the realms of the Thervingi, a Gothic people who ruled the lands north of the lower Danube and west of the Dniester. Reaching the rank of lector within his local church, Ulfilas was chosen to accompany a diplomatic mission to Constantinople during the reign of Constantine the Great. He may have even lived in the city for a time. Exactly how Ulfilas's consecration occurred is unclear. However, what we do know is that the Gothic clergyman was anointed as Bishop of the Goths in around the year 340 AD by the Arian Archbishop of Constantinople, Eusebius of Nicomedia. Evidently the Romans saw something in the young Goth whom they charged with returning to Gothic lands and spreading the gospel. The timing of Ulfilas's consecration is significant. 340 AD was shortly after the Council of Nicaea, but before Arianism had been definitively rejected by the imperial church. Constantinople in this period was a centre of Arian Christianity, and Eusebius of Nicomedia was one of Arianism's most powerful advocates. Ulfilas's formation as a bishop in this context ensured that the Christianity he would bring to the Goths would be Arian rather than Nicene. Until 348 AD, Ulfilas dwelt in Gothic lands, preaching the Arian doctrine both to Christians and pagans. In 348 AD, his activities were arrested by persecutions, and the bishop was expelled, settling within the Roman Empire near Nicopolis, where he remained until his death in 383. During his period of exile, Ulfilas completed a monumental project, the creation of the Gothic alphabet and the translation of the Bible into Gothic. This translation was a seminal step, and one which helped to accelerate the spread of Christianity amongst the Goths. The Bible gave the Goths access to Christian scripture in their own language, making the religion far more accessible than if worship had been conducted entirely in Greek or Latin. Interestingly, later sources claim that Ulfilas deliberately did not translate the books of Kings in the Old Testament, fearing that the Goths, being warlike by nature, would be encouraged to even greater violence by the military narratives contained in those books. Whether this is true or later invention is unclear, but it reflects perceptions of Gothic character and the concerns of Christian missionaries working among Germanic peoples. The conversion to Christianity appears to have been a relatively swift process, perhaps aided by the fact that groups of Anatolian Christians in diaspora already lived amongst the Goths. Conversion was obviously not a universal or monolithic process. However, bouts of persecution periodically broke out, most notably in 348 AD under the Thervingi king Alaric, and again in the mid-360s until the late 370s AD under his son Athanaric. These later persecutions included the creation of a number of Gothic martyrs. The Passion of St. Sabas, who died in 372 AD, provides a detailed account of one such martyr's death. Sabas, a Gothic Christian, was drowned in a river on the orders of a local chieftain who was enforcing Athanaric's persecution. The account emphasizes Sabas's steadfastness in faith despite torture and his ultimate willingness to die rather than renounce Christianity. By the advent of the 5th century AD, the Goths appear to have largely converted to Christianity. However, as we've already noted, the particular form of Christianity to which the Goths subscribed was Arianism. It is important to understand the differences between Arianism and so-called Nicene Christianity, the orthodox belief system formulated at the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. While the orthodoxy agreed at Nicaea held that God existed in the Trinity as three persons, co-eternal and consubstantial, Arians instead believed that Jesus had been created by God. First preached by the Alexandrian priest Arius, Arianism insisted that God was eternal and uncreated but had in fact created Christ, who in turn created the Holy Spirit. The theological implications of this difference are profound. Nicene Christianity asserts that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are equally divine, existing together from eternity. Arianism creates a hierarchy within the Trinity, with the Father superior to the Son, who is in turn superior to the Holy Spirit. This had implications for understanding salvation, worship, and the nature of Christ's relationship to humanity. Although the First Council of Nicaea had rejected this idea in 325 AD, Arians enjoyed a certain amount of tolerance. It was not until the Second Council held in 381 AD that Arianism was formally declared a heresy. This official rejection of Arianism had important ramifications for the newly Christianized Goths. Despite Arianism falling from imperial favour, the Goths clung to their faith. It has been suggested that this is partly down to the Goths and other Germanic peoples viewing their Arian faith as being intrinsic to their identity. Arianism was not especially widespread within the Roman Empire, particularly following the declaration of the doctrine as heresy in 381 AD, though it appears to be the case that Arianism came to be closely associated with being Germanic. This association between Arianism and Germanic identity had important political implications. In the post-Roman kingdoms established by Germanic peoples across the Western Empire, religious difference marked the boundary between Germanic rulers and Roman subjects. Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Burgundians were all Arian, while their Roman subjects were Nicene. This religious divide sometimes exacerbated political tensions, but also helped Germanic minorities maintain distinct identities while ruling over much larger Roman populations. However, Arianism was eventually abandoned by the Visigoths of Spain during the late 6th century. Attempts to reach a doctrinal compromise between Catholics and Arians within the kingdom during the reign of King Leovigild failed, with his successor Recared renouncing Arianism in favour of Chalcedonian Christianity in 587 AD. The 589 Third Council of Toledo formalised the conversion of Visigothic Spain. Persecutions of Arians ensued. The disappearance of Arianism removed a major point of contention between the increasingly Romanized Visigoths and the Hispano-Roman subjects. The conversion facilitated the integration of Gothic and Roman populations, allowing intermarriage and the creation of a more unified Visigothic Roman culture. However, it also meant the loss of a distinctive Gothic religious identity that had persisted for over 2 centuries. Following the Gothic victory at Adrianople and the settlement of large numbers of Goths within the Balkan regions of the empire, the Goths had achieved some modicum of stability, at least when compared with the chaos that they had endured due to the Hunnic invasions. The Goths, increasingly Romanized, enjoyed freer commerce with the Romans and began to utilize Roman farming techniques. However, all was not plain sailing. The traditional power structures of the Goths, upended by the flight from the Huns, left these Germanic people without strong leadership and less able to resist the overtures of the imperial authorities who pressed thousands of Gothic warriors into service. What is more, the Balkans were not a particularly verdant territory for an agricultural people used to the fertile soils of the Pontic steppe. Into this power vacuum stepped a Goth named Alaric. We know little of his early life, but he does appear to have participated in the Battle of the River Frigidus, in which thousands of Gothic troops died in the service of the Emperor Theodosius. 395 was a seminal year for Alaric for two reasons. For one, the Emperor Theodosius died, the last emperor to rule over a united empire. Upon his death, the empire was split between his sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west, with the Goths conspicuously in the middle. It was also in this year that the Goths rose in open revolt with Alaric as their chief, demanding better treatment from the imperial authorities. Raiding in Greece ensued throughout the late 390s, and in late 401 or early 402, Alaric's forces invaded Italy, only turning back after fighting two inconclusive engagements with the Roman general Stilicho. By 406 AD, the pressure of the westward-moving Huns had set off a chain reaction of migrating barbarian peoples who entered the Western Roman Empire by force, seeking safety and new lands in which to settle. These migrations permanently destabilized the Western Empire, arguably directly leading to its collapse several decades later. In the spring of 406, an Ostrogothic king named Radagaisus led a confederacy of Germanic and Celtic peoples on an invasion of northern Italy, and was only defeated with great difficulty by Stilicho in the August of 406. The Roman general had to pull considerable numbers of garrison troops from the Rhine frontier in order to achieve this. In December, the great barbarian Rhine crossing saw vast numbers of Vandals, Alans and Suebi pour into the Western Empire, causing chaos across Roman Gaul. Alaric saw his opportunity and once again marched on Italy in the spring of 408. His campaign was unexpectedly aided by imperial machinations when in the August of 408 the half-Vandal Roman general Stilicho was murdered on the orders of the Emperor Honorius. The death of Stilicho, perhaps the Western Empire's most capable general, was a disastrous turn of events. Stilicho's German federati troops deserted en masse to join Alaric, along with the last remnants of Radagaisus's defeated Goths, further swelling his ranks. The Greek historian Zosimus, writing at the end of the 5th century, noted Alaric's intentions as he marched towards the vulnerable city of Rome. Alaric's demands were as follows: that each year he be paid a fixed sum of gold and be supplied a certain measure of grain, and that he and all his followers settle in both Venetia, Noricum, and in Dalmatia. These demands, which Jovius, who was Honorius's praetorian prefect, wrote down in Alaric's presence and dispatched to the emperor. Clearly, Alaric's initial intention was not the despoiling of the imperial city, but the securing of lands, food, and gold for his followers. Gothic respect for imperial prestige, despite the weakness of the Western Empire, was such that Alaric even sought an imperial title to legitimize his reign. Even at this late stage, Rome's fate was by no means sealed. However, Rome was by the early 5th century no longer the capital of the Western Empire. The transferring of the capital to Milan in the late 3rd century and then to Ravenna in 401 AD meant that Rome's political importance had waned somewhat, and Constantine's foundation of his new capital of Constantinople had accelerated this process. As a result, the Western Emperor Honorius, shut up in Ravenna, refused to negotiate with Alaric when the Gothic king threatened Rome. In late 408, an initial Gothic siege of Rome was ended when the city agreed to pay Alaric considerable tribute. Let me show you the numbers that reveal the scale of this tribute. Ancient sources report that Rome paid Alaric 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, 4,000 silk tunics, 3,000 scarlet-dyed skins, and 3,000 pounds of pepper. The gold and silver alone represented an enormous sum, perhaps equivalent to several years of tax revenue from wealthy provinces. This tribute temporarily satisfied Alaric, but did not resolve the fundamental problem. The Goths still lacked permanent lands and ongoing supplies. Frustrated by Honorius's obstinate refusal to come to terms, Alaric once again marched on Rome in the summer of 410, facing almost no resistance. On the 24th of August 410 AD, the Salarian Gate was opened, whether by treachery or by starvation-induced desperation, and the Goths flooded into the Eternal City. The infamous sack of Rome was, by the standards of the day, remarkably restrained. Perhaps owing in large part to the fact that Alaric and his Goths were Christians. The vast majority of Rome's ancient monuments and Christian churches were left untouched. Although the old Senate house was set on fire, as were 2 basilicas in the Forum, and all movable loot was plundered and carried off by the Goths, the level of destruction was limited compared to what might have been expected. The citizens of Rome, however, would have suffered enormously despite the lack of wholesale murder. Many inhabitants were tortured into revealing the location of hidden treasures, including the 85-year-old Saint Marcella, and thousands of Romans became refugees. For the first time in almost 800 years, the city had fallen to foreign invaders. Although Rome held little political or strategic importance anymore, the psychological impact of the sack was enormous. Here was the downfall of a symbolic city from which the great ancient empire had issued forth. Contemporary writers such as Jerome lamented the fall. When the brightest light of the world was extinguished, when the very head of the Roman Empire was severed, the entire world perished in a single city. Others, such as St. Augustine of Hippo, sought to assuage the growing feeling that it was Rome's abandonment of the old pagan gods and the embrace of Christianity which had led to the downfall of the empire. Alaric's sack of the old capital precipitated a genuine spiritual crisis and spawned many attempts to understand or rationalize the fall, including Augustine's famous City of God. That said, the Western Emperor Honorius was apparently unconcerned. According to the Byzantine historian Procopius, he received the news of Rome's fall thus. At that time they say that the Emperor Honorius in Ravenna received the message from one of the eunuchs, evidently a keeper of the poultry, that Rome had perished, and he cried out and said, "And yet it has just eaten from my hands." For he had a very large cock, Roma by name, and the eunuch, comprehending his words, said that it was the city of Rome which had perished at the hands of Alaric. And the emperor, with a sigh of relief, answered quickly, "But I thought that my foul Roma had perished." So great, they say, was the folly with which this emperor was possessed. This anecdote, whether literally true or not, captures contemporary perceptions of Honorius as a weak and ineffectual ruler, more concerned with trivialities than with the crumbling empire he nominally governed. Despite their apparent triumph, Alaric and his Goths were in a precarious situation. The sack of the Eternal City effectively ended any chance of a settlement with Honorius, and with it the promise of permanent settlement which the itinerant Goths so craved. Deep in hostile territory, the Goths made southwards, apparently intending to cross to Sicily or into the rich provinces of Roman North Africa. However, stormy weather scuppered many of the ships that Alaric had gathered to facilitate the crossing, and in early 411 the great king himself died, perhaps of a fever. His followers supposedly buried him beneath the bed of the Busento River and afterwards killed the gravediggers in order to protect his resting place. Alaric's historical importance is hard to overstate. Not only did he sack the Eternal City, but it is arguably around him that the Goths who crossed the Roman frontier coalesced, going from a desperate group devastated by the impact of Hunnic raiding in the late 4th century to a united people who went on to found the Visigothic Kingdom in southern Gaul in 418 AD. The next chapter of Gothic history centres around the Gothic kingdoms that emerged during the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in the west. The Visigothic Kingdom in southern Gaul and later Spain, and the Ostrogothic Kingdom in northern Italy. Both of these realms have a wealth of intriguing history and culture to consider and deserve explorations in their own right. Therefore, for now, we will leave the Goths in the south of Italy, mourning the loss of their great king Alaric. Poised on the brink of a new chapter in their long and fascinating history,